All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Tyler Butler. I'm a program manager on the Office Online team. I'm seeing some familiar faces, so I have a feeling that if I ask this question, I'll see some hands. How many folks are familiar with WOPI? See, I knew you were going to raise your hand. Okay, a few people. Of you who have seen our new documentation, new-ish, in the last couple of years on Read the Docs? Okay, great. All right, so for everybody else, I'm here to talk about WOPI, the Web Application Open Platform Interface. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the way that WOPI works with Office Online, that is Word, Excel, PowerPoint on the web. WOPI goes beyond Office Online now. We've expanded it to other WOPI clients, but I'm going to focus on Office Online. The principal place where you can read about WOPI is at wopi.readthedocs.io. I'll talk a little bit more about how that documentation is structured towards the end of the talk. So WOPI is all about integrating with Office Online. That is, you have files stored in some file storage location, and you want to expose those files in a way that Office Online can open and edit them. So for example, your SharePoint, you have files stored in SharePoint, you want Office Online to be able to open and edit those documents. So the way that the WOPI flow works is that there is a browser and then a WOPI host, also known as a WOPI server, and a WOPI client. So for the purposes of this discussion, let's assume that the host is SharePoint, but it doesn't have to be. We have lots of other hosts. And that the WOPI client in this particular case is the Office Web Apps or Office Online. So the way the WOPI flow works at a high level is essentially that in the browser, there's a host frame. That is a page that is owned by the storage host, SharePoint in this case. And that host frame comes from the storage host. Like that's a page that is owned and served up by the storage host. Inside that host frame, there is an iframe that points to the Office Online application. And that inner iframe gets some information from the host, including an access token and a URL called a WOPI source, which is essentially a URL that when a request is made to it, it returns some information about a specific file. And then the access token is used for auth purposes. Once the app frame, that's the inner iframe that's pointing to the Office Online URL, once that is navigated to, then Office Online makes a WOPI request to the WOPI source URL using the access token that was provided by the host. And then you, the host, respond to that request. And so the WOPI protocol is basically all of the pieces between the client and the WOPI server. So in this particular case, it's the arrow on the right there. So when we think about sort of typical scenario of just viewing a file that's stored in a storage host, the flow is pretty straightforward. So user is in their browser and they navigate to some URL on SharePoint. That's the requesting the view of the file. The WOPI server returns a bunch of information to the client in terms of how to talk to the browser that tells it how to construct that inner iframe pointing to Office Online. Then the browser makes that request, the iframe request to the WOPI client, that's Office Online, and says a whole bunch of, and then the WOPI client, talks to the WOPI server at that point and says, hey, give me some information about the file, give me the file contents itself, and then the client, Office Online, knows how to render that file once it retrieves it. Any questions before we move on? I know I went pretty quickly through that. No. All right. So you might be wondering, well, how does the host, how does the WOPI server know the URLs to point that inner iframe to? How does it know what the URLs for Office Online are? And the answer is a process called WOPI discovery. So Office Online publishes a set of public URLs that return some XML information that tells you the URLs to use to instantiate Office Online apps. So what happens is that periodically, SharePoint, I believe, does it once every 24 hours, the WOPI host makes a request to our discovery URL and says, give me the latest data on the Office Online apps. And we return a bunch of XML, like I said, that tells the host how to construct those URLs. I'll talk about this briefly. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's all documented and it's not super interesting to talk about here. But the big thing is that for every, the WOPI discovery information, for every application and file extension defines a number of actions. And those actions are things that this WOPI client, Office Online, knows what to do, how to do with the file. So for example, the view action is the simplest action. And it has a URL that's defined here with some placeholders, which I'll talk about in a minute, and an extension. So this means that the Word application knows how to execute a view action on a file with an extension of docx. And if you look at the Discovery XML for the Cloud Office Online service, you'll notice that we have a bunch of different actions and a bunch of different file extensions that are supported. So for example, for the view action, we support legacy binary Office file formats like .doc, and we also support open formats like ODT. So, but the URLs are exposed through this mechanism of discovery. So as part of integration, you call discovery to get these URLs that you then use as the interface. All right, so a couple of things about the action stuff. The actual handling of the URL is a little bit complex. We are looking at ways to make this a little bit easier, including not using XML, some other format that makes it a little bit easier to work with. But if you look at these placeholder values, the things in the angle brackets, these placeholder values are things that you as the person who's integrating with Office Online can replace to change the behavior of the application. So these particular examples are for the locale or the UI language that we'll use. So if you're integrating and you say, well, this user has their language set to Greek, then you could specify you could replace the UI LLCC placeholder value with with the Greek language code, and then we would render in Greek. There are lots of other placeholders, and we are adding new ones periodically. And all of the details of what each of those placeholders does and where they're relevant is covered in our documentation as well. And there's a link. I don't know if these decks are going to be available, but okay, they are. Great. So yeah, there's a link directly to the section of the docs where we talk about how to handle the URL source. Any questions on discovery? All right. So let's talk about the actual protocol. So we've talked about just how the Office Online integration works, and I gave a brief overview of the overall WOPI flow, but we haven't actually talked about the operations that the WOPI host implements that the client then calls. So when you become a WOPI server, essentially you construct these endpoints with well-known URL patterns. It's always /WOPI and then / the object that you're working with at that time. So the most easy to understand one is files. So you construct an endpoint that we will make REST requests to, and that endpoint is of the form /WOPI /files /an ID to a file. There are other endpoints as well, including folders and containers, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but the most interesting and critical one is the files endpoint. So again, we're going back to that view flow. So the WOPI host generates a client URL based on the Discovery XML. That's that URL source that I just talked about. The WOPI host navigates a page to that URL, and then the WOPI client, Office Online in this case, makes a GET to the WOPI URL that the server provided it.
Why are you using WOPI host and WOPI WOPI server internally for the same thing? It's kind of
Yeah, I admit it's confusing. It's a 50-50 split in terms of what terminology we use. Both are interchangeable.
okay.
Yeah. Typically, internally in the team, we refer to them as hosts, storage hosts.
Okay.
But from a protocol perspective, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's a client-server protocol.
Right.
So I apologize. I do try to be consistent, but I fail.
I wonder if host is more when it's going towards the browser and server it's more when it's going towards the WOPI client, or there's not that distinction?
We don't make that distinction. We use them literally interchangeably. Yeah.
It becomes a bit more confusing when you add the Office Online server,
Right.
which
Yes.
is a client.
Right.
Yes. That does further complicate things.
So I think what confused me on the WOPI is all the use cases, right? Like eventually how you implement this into the use case, but I can ask at the end. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll have plenty of times for Q&A. So in step 3, we make a request to the WOPI endpoint to get some information about the file, not the actual file contents, just some metadata about it. This is the most critical WOPI request. It's called check file info. It is the place where we get all information about the file, including its size, its name, and it's where you configure things like, oh, I want to disable printing for this user, or I want to disable apps from the store, like apps in the Office apps. And so after we get information about the file, it also contains permissions, so we ensure that the user has permissions. So once we get the metadata about the file and we check those permissions that came back in that metadata, then we issue what's called a get file request, which is essentially just, hey, give me the binary contents of the file. And once we have that, we render it and display it in the browser to the user. And from the user's perspective, they see a host URL that is a URL that points to, say, SharePoint. But under the covers, all the heavy lifting is in an iframe that is pointing to the Office Online service. So I mentioned this. This is the check file info operation, and it returns a whole bunch of different information, but it's all JSON formatted, and there's no hierarchy in the JSON schema. It's a very simple JSON schema. It's all flat. There's both a pro and a con on the check file info request. The pro is that everything's in one place, and the con is everything's in one place. So we're looking at design changes to the protocol that might let us split up these properties into buckets that would improve boot performance in some cases, because if it's expensive for you to return, for example, the version of the file in your check file info response, then that's the very first thing that we're going to do on boot. And so if that's expensive for you, then it means that our boot is expensive because we're blocking booting waiting on that check file info request. So we're looking at ways to either add another operation or to get more details about the files up front in a secure way so that we don't have to wait for this check file info request. But from a protocol perspective, the only thing that's required in a check file info request are these 5 properties. So technically speaking, you can boot Office Online in view mode against a file by returning only these 5 properties.
Are they all required? I don't think that the SHA-256 is required.
Oh, no.
One
Yes, you are correct. Yes, this is yes. I need to update this slide. Yes, SHA-256 is not required. It's a nice to have, but it is not required. What should be there is user ID. User ID is required. Excuse me. So remember I was talking about endpoints. There's the files endpoint. This is called the file contents endpoint. It's really straightforward. All you can do with it is get a file and then put a file. And in both cases, it's full binary bytes of the file. There's no incremental sort of thing. It's pure HTTP GET, HTTP POST. These are just other operations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the client-side integration, and by client in this context, I mean the browser. So you might think, well, hey, I really want to be able to share documents from, like when I'm viewing a document, I want the user to be able to click a share button and then share that document. The way that we do this in Office Online is through post message. This is a HTML5 API that just lets us do message passing between an iframe and an outer frame. And so the canonical example of post message is share, because what happens when you click the sharing button is that we post a message out to that host frame and we say, hey, the user just clicked the share button. And then the host page does a bunch of stuff. It says, okay, the user just clicked the share button. I need to display some sharing UI that lets the user share. And in the past, we have not done a great job of actually documenting and supporting those post messages. They've been sort of hidden and not treated as part of the WOPI protocol proper. That is no longer the case. We treat post messages just like we do the rest of WOPI. It's a supported part of the protocol. It's a supported part of the integration. The one downside to post messages are that they work great for web-based clients. They do not work so great for actual native clients. So when I talk about WOPI for iOS clients, it doesn't make sense to use post message because post message doesn't exist for those clients. So we have some alternatives that we use in those cases, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we talked about share. If we bring all of this stuff together, so the way that the host says, hey, I want to receive this share post message, I know how to handle it, please send it to me, is through check file info. There's a, file sharing post message property in check file info. So we call check, you say, hey, I want the sharing post message to be sent, please. And Office Online says, great, I'm going to draw that sharing button, and when that button is clicked, I'm going to send you that sharing post message. As part of that contract, when the sharing message is sent, the host sends us a blur message, which basically says, hey, stop trying to steal focus and stop trying to do all of the stuff that you're normally doing because I'm displaying UI now. You display your sharing UI, and then when the user is done interacting with that sharing UI, it's essentially a modal dialog. They click OK or close that. Then the host says, OK, Office Online, I'm done. You can start doing what you normally do and be aggressive about grabbing focus and whatnot. So this flow is one that we use very often. There's similar post messages for things like previous versions. So you can have previous versions show up in our UI, and when you click, that can navigate you to a place, etc. I don't think so. It's been there for a while. There's both a URL and a post message.
It was added and it wasn't announced in any way. It may have been added to the protocol, to the doc, but how often do you go through the list of post message,
So, I mean, this one we've had since 2011, I think, 2012. Yes, previous versions. Now, it's entirely possible that it's not in the docs for some reason, but it should be. I'll double check on it.
I haven't seen it in
Okay.
the documents maybe I don't think the previous version.
Okay. I'll double check. It's possible that it's been drafted and hasn't been published yet too.
Is there a mechanism to request post message functionality?
So that's a good question. The question was, is there a way to request post message functionality? I assume that you mean you have new features or something that you want.
I want to know who's joining a co-authoring session, and I want to know when that person leaves the co-authoring session. You have that information. We need to have that.
I see. And doing it on the back end is insufficient because you also have that information on the back end.
We don't.
You should get lock requests and check requests from.
Usually no. It's not sufficient. Let's put it this way. We know who requested, but we don't know if the other person exited the session, right? We only know about unlocks, but we don't
Yes.
What happened in between?
Yeah. So we do have a post message. We do have a post message that tells you sort of when users are leaving. And
There's one on exit, but there is nothing. I guess you could try and track it that way.
I mean for that particular, well, so I think you've asked two questions. The first question was, hey, how do I request that there be new post messages added for various scenarios, which I'll cover in just a minute. But the specific question, how do I know when someone stops editing? How does a WOPI host know when an editing session is finished?
Not the editing session, but somebody from the authoring session.
That's covered here too, yeah. Because there is a post message that tells you whether or not the user is editing, which you can use as a proxy. It's not ideal, I grant you. But so to answer your first question though, we have this program, which I've not talked about, called the Cloud Storage Partner Program. And that program is the way that if you want to integrate your cloud storage product with Office Online or Office for iOS using the WOPI protocol, that's the program that you would join to do that. As part of that program, we have a Yammer group with discussion and requests come in that way. That is the best way to make those sorts of asks. And as you know, I'm on there a lot. So, other questions? Okay. This is not a complete list. The complete list is in the documentation, but there are several different messages. I would encourage you, if you take advantage of these post messages, pardon me, that there are typically corresponding URL properties that we expose through checks. So for example, file sharing post message is a Boolean that says, hey, I'm expecting to get that post message. File sharing URL is a URL that when navigated to will allow the user to share. The reason both are important are because it is no longer the case that all WOPI clients are web-based. So if you are a non-web-based client and you want to show a share button, well, you can't use post message. You need to be able to do something else. The lowest common denominator is that you show a button and then navigate to the file sharing URL when the button is clicked. So for maximum compatibility across all different types of WOPI clients, we recommend that you set both the post message properties, which Office Online will use, and corresponding URL properties. Share is especially interesting because we actually added operations to the WOPI protocol itself that would allow a client to get a sharing URL from the host using a WOPI request instead of doing it through the client, the browser client. And we may do that for other types of operations that are shared across all WOPI clients, but right now sharing is the big one. All right, so the last thing I want to talk specifically about Office Online is something called proof keys. Proof keys are optional. They are not required. However, they can make things simpler from a security perspective. So proof keys are basically just a way for the WOPI host to know that the requests are coming from Office Online. So we publish a public key, and then we sign every request, and we send the signature in a header, the proof key header, and you can take that header, check and verify that it came from us using our public key. We sign it with a private key, you have our public key, you can then validate. The public key is actually part of WOPI Discovery, which is one reason why you have to do WOPI Discovery periodically. Because if we rotate the keys periodically, so you need to be getting the latest public key in order for proof keys to work. In terms of what our partners are doing right now, I'd say it's about 50-50 between those that use proof keys and those that don't. SharePoint uses proof keys. Internal Microsoft hosts typically use proof keys. But again, it is optional. It just makes, if you care a lot about ensuring that the only WOPI requests that you're responding to are coming from Office Online, then proof keys are a great option. If you want to support Office for iOS, though, you can't use proof keys because the only reason they work well in Office Online is because it's a server-based product. When you have a client, you can't be signing all the requests that are coming from the client. Speaking of clients, WOPI goes beyond Office Online, as I mentioned at the begining. The key clients right now are Office Online and Office for iOS. Those are the two that are sort of open and ready for business. But the other three are coming: Microsoft Teams, Outlook, and Office for Android. In fact, Office for Android should be ready fairly soon. Outlook and Microsoft Teams, I think, are in the fairly early stages. But what this means is that if you support Office Online integration, then there is only an incremental cost to also supporting Office for iOS. Because the core of the protocol is the same. There's just some additional extensions necessary for iOS. And those extensions come in the form of 3 additional endpoints. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what each of these is, but we can certainly talk about it during Q&A if folks are interested. So the first new endpoint is containers. This is different than folders. The reason is somewhat silly, but folders was originally designed specifically for OneNote, and it relies on a bunch of semantics that really don't make sense outside of OneNote. So when we started making WOPI work for iOS and Android, et cetera, instead of trying to retrofit the folders namespace and make it work for the scenarios we needed to, we created a new one called containers. And if it's helpful to think of containers as folders, you can, but they don't have to be folders. But essentially what containers lets you do is navigate hierarchies. So if you want to have a browse experience like the Office for iOS client does, where you can say, I'm on SharePoint, browse folders, find the document I want, open that document, all of that communication is done via WOPI, and it's using containers to browse and navigate the hierarchy. The other thing we added was ecosystem. Ecosystem it's very hard to describe and very hard to understand. I apologize. But in the past, WOPI has always required that there be a specific resource that you're working with, a file ID, a container ID, and I have an access token that grants me access to just that resource. Ecosystem is different. Ecosystem, there is no resource. The resource is the ecosystem. So this is useful in cases like Office for iOS, where you don't start by getting an access token. How do you, like in Office Online, you're navigating to some page on the storage host, and it's giving you an access token. So at the time your application is starting, you have an access token. In a native application, you don't have that. So the ecosystem endpoint helps bridge that gap, essentially. And then the second half to bridging that gap is the bootstrapper. The bootstrapper basically lets you integrate OAuth and WOPI access tokens together. WOPI access tokens are kind of like a subset of OAuth. But we added the bootstrapper instead of making WOPI require OAuth for a number of reasons. But one is because not everybody's using OAuth. And the second is because for legacy reasons and backcompat, we don't want to make the statement that WOPI requires that you be using OAuth access tokens. WOPI is actually pretty auth agnostic. Like the access token has specific requirements, but if those requirements are met, no matter what auth scheme you're using, WOPI will just work. This is what lets us integrate with nearly 100 storage hosts in our production cloud environment without requiring that they all implement either single sign-on with Microsoft authentication or OAuth 2, et cetera. All right, so all of this is, like I say, covered in the docs. Speaking of the docs, I do want to describe how they're organized now because it's a little bit confusing. As we add more WOPI clients, we're trying to figure out what is the right way to organize the documentation. This scheme makes sense when we only have basically 2 clients, but as we grow the number of clients, it gets a little more complicated. Anyway, when you first land on wopi.readthedocs.io, you will be in the Office Online integration documentation. The reason that is the case is because we were the first WOPI client to support integration, so it made sense that when you go to look at the documentation, you land on Office Online integration docs. There are links there to the Office iOS integration documentation and to the WOPI REST reference. So I'll show you what that looks like. So this is where you land when you hit wopi.readthedocs.io.
I'm not sure we're seeing all those things that you say.
Oh, I apologize. Okay. Well, this is going to be interesting. All right.
I think even before you were thinking you were seeing something.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that. Anyway, this is the Office Online integration docs. This is where you land. And if you click the reference, it takes you to the REST API reference. And this is where you can see the specific operations. And they're all documented here. So most times what people end up doing is they have two tabs open, one with the REST documentation and the other with the Office Online integration documentation. This is public. It's hosted on GitHub. We have issue tracker there. We welcome contributions. There's sample code. And I keep asking people to submit their code, sample code, and they say they will, but then they don't. So perhaps you can buck the trend and share your samples. Yeah.
Sorry. You know, using work with auth, that's very useful. Under construction link, is it going to be completed at any point?
The intent is yes. The question of when is unclear. I'll pull back the curtain a little bit. One of the challenges that we have is that WOPI originated in the Office Online team. It is primarily an Office Online protocol. And when we added the iOS extensions and everything, we're not at a point where we can handle all of the documentation of the integrations with those particular clients. And so we're sort of relying on the Office for iOS team to shore up that documentation, and they have not yet done so. That's not a great reason, but that's where we are right now. The last thing I want to plug for is the WOPI validator. So we added this as part of integrations with partners. We realized that the only way that we could scale to dozens and hundreds of partners all implementing the same protocol was to have some sort of validation that ensured that that protocol was being implemented properly. And the other big challenge with WOPI is that it's somewhat flexible. You don't have to implement all of it to integrate with a specific client. You can do a view-only integration in Office Online with implementing check file info and get file, and you're done. And so we needed a way to ensure that that implementations were correct so that we could sign off on them and get them into production. But we also needed a way to say, hey, even though this property is optional in the protocol, it's actually required for Office Online, or it's actually required for Office for iOS. So the validator is kind of a combination of, are you adhering to the protocol, and also, are you doing the things that are necessary for integration with a specific client? So we have a set of tests in there that are just about protocol cleanliness. And then we have a separate set of tests that are sort of covering the integrations with specific clients. The other thing is that the WOPI validator is basically yet another Office Online app. It works, and behaves just like Word, Excel, PowerPoint Online. That is, it has a URL that is advertised in WOPI Discovery. You invoke that URL, you pass it an access token, it makes WOPI requests on behalf of you using that access token. It behaves just like a regular Office Online app. It's just running test cases rather than actually viewing and editing documents. So yeah, in fact, when we do integrations with partners as part of the Cloud Storage Partner Program, we do not troubleshoot anything until you have passing WOPI validator tests, because it turns out that 90% of issues are resolved by running the validator and then fixing what it says. So. All right, so that brings us to the, I did this again, didn't I? Yeah. All right. There we go. All right, so I think I've covered all the content slide-wise. I'm sure there are questions or feedback that folks have, scenarios you want to talk about, so let's open it up. Questions, scenarios?
So what are the main storage use cases, right? Like who are the main vendors that now Office Online?
Oh, goodness. So I'll talk about some of the larger integrations that are outside Microsoft. We have with Dropbox and Box, an EDU partner named Edmodo, VK, which is, I call it Russian Facebook. It's broader than just Russia, but it's very large in Russia. Cloudmail.ru, another Russian mail provider.
So the WOPI
those
servers will be outside of the Microsoft cloud, basically?
So the WOPI servers, yes, are owned by those partners, and the WOPI client servers, yeah, exactly, meaning the Office Online servers, those are within the Microsoft data centers. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Not used by Office Online. It will never be used by Office Online?
It might be used by Office Online. In order for it to be used broadly in Office Online, we need to teach Office Online how to do OAuth. That's not technically true, but for a lot of the scenarios where browsing for files and things, we think.
When you're starting off from a place, not from a resource.
Oh, hey, am I in your way?
No,
Sorry.
I just took your drink.
Oh, did you?
Sorry.
Did you drink?
I did.
I apologize. Hey, I just came back from Mexico, so.
Any test that you're waiting for?
Yeah, no test results outstanding, so I think I'm good.
Carry on.
Sorry, say that again. The containers endpoint?
Yes, so basically, so if you are, say, adding a place just like you would in Office for iOS, for example,
Yeah.
then yes, you definitely need something. But if you
Yeah.
already, if you could do the save and start navigating from that place, so from that resource. So you are, say, in
yes.
Excel, you do save as in the same folder, but what if I wanted to
Yes.
save as up top? In that case, you
Yeah.
don't need all.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so for those scenarios, yes, we don't need OAuth.
So great to have that because people would, like in our use case, in 99% cases, they would not need to start from scratch. They would be starting from the dock.
Right,
And
right.
that would be ideal. The saving into the same folder is like,
So
how useful is that?
we hear conflicting feedback about the save as and folder navigation story. On the one hand, some partners think that we should just have a generic folder browsing UI and experience within Office Online and use containers and sort of navigate that way. Other folks are like, no, I have an awesome file browse experience for my app. You know, I'm Dropbox or I'm Box, and I built my own file picker and experience, and I have search capabilities, and I have all this stuff that I can do in this picker that I've designed specifically for my app. What I really want you to do is let me use that instead of something generic.
Can you make it configurable or have a like just like
Yeah.
you can do your own edits or so when edit is click or close or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You have a way to override what the whole normal behavior.
Right. Yeah. So we can certainly do that sort of experience as well, where we make it configurable, like use my folder picking experience or use a generic folder picking experience. Yeah.
Sir, is save as Excel, is it ever gonna go into Word and PowerPoint? Save as.
Yes, it is, and we're working on it at the moment. Right now, we're starting with SharePoint. And I believe we already have it for OneDrive. Save as in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint is already there in OneDrive. So after that, it will be exposed for external partners as well. There's a question of design there. Like the current design works well with the hosts that we've integrated with. We're not sure it scales. So, and yeah, that's where the hang up is. But yes, we are aware of that need.
So if there's any other questions, maybe we can
Yeah,
take
absolutely.
them outside. And Tyler, thank you for your time.
Yeah.